Cooke, horological curator at the British Museum. Graces us with his presence today. I'm sorry I won't repeat all the glowing words I said about him a minute ago. We've now got it sorted, so I can't do my glowing introductions until the red light is blinking. It's now blinking, and it's now again my pleasure and honor to introduce Oliver Cooke.
What Bob didn't specify is that whether we should be using equal hours or not. So when I rehearsed this last night, it was exactly 35 minutes. So thank you very much for asking me here to speak. It's a great honour, and it's a great symposium, already great symposium on the great collectors. And thank you, you've all been wonderful hosts, and particularly I'd like to thank Bob and Jean for making me feel very welcome in this. Every time I've worked at the museum over the last 15 years, or whatever it is, I feel this benign presence looking over my shoulder, which as he is now. There's Courtenay Adrian Ilbert, whose colossal collection came to the museum in 1958. And over the next 35 minutes, I'll be looking at his life, his collecting, and also how his collection continues to impact and serve the public and the horological community all over the world. We can only really look at the brief edited highlights today. There's so much more to talk, but we will stop and sniff some of the roses on the way. Now, before we get into it, I must be very clear indeed that I owe a huge debt of thanks to Paul Buck, who was my boss at the museum for many years. He retired in 2017 after he retired in 2017, having worked there for 28 years. And he conducted extensive research on Ilbert, and he's published 2 articles around it, and there's going to be more in horology. And many of the slides you're going to see tonight come from his 2008 Dingwall Beeler lecture. So, but I am here with his blessing, but I want to thank you, Paul. It is, and I think Paul himself would be first to thank Jacqueline Duncan. And Jacqueline Duncan, you may know, she founded the Inchbald School of Design in 1960. And she was married to Michael Inchbald, who was Courtney's nephew, and she loved her uncle dearly. And many of the fond notes you will hear today are from her. So thank you, Jacqueline. So we'll start on Ilbert's early years. He was born in Reading in south of England in 1888. But he spent his childhood in South Devon, and this is Thurleston Beach, where he lived close to. And Malcolm Gardner, who was Ilbert's friend in later life, quite a very close friend in later life, said he was a collector from an early age, and that as a boy he collected pebbles from the Devonshire beaches. And Ilbert's father, Arthur, had a successful textile making business operating out of Shanghai, where he found married his mother, Beatrice, and they moved back to England to have their children. But Arthur died when Courtney was only 11 years of age, and just to mention, he left Beatrice a estate worth several millions of pounds, which would prove important later. And he also specified as well that on Beatrice's death, 2/3 should go to Courtney, to Ilbert, and the remaining third to his sister Evelyn. So Ilbert went to school at the prestigious Eton School in Windsor, and while he was there, he went to an auction. He bought a box of watch components. 3 days later, he had 3 working watches. He went on in 1906 to King's College in Cambridge, where he studied civil engineering. He left there in 1910. And one of his first jobs, he was proud to tell everyone, was working on Tower Bridge. And in the summer of 1921, Courtney's mother Beatrice took out a lease on a property in South West London, a very spacious property in South West London, 10 Milner Street, and that spaciousness would become very important, as you'll see later. And then she died in 1925, and one can presume he then inherited 2/3 of the estate. And it's no surprise that his collecting really began in earnest then. Also around this time, we know he met some certain Major Paul Chamberlain, who we're going to hear about later from Tom McIntyre. And he seems to have been Ilbert's single greatest influence in watch collecting, and for that we salute him. We have 48 letters from Chamberlain at the museum. And I can't obviously go through them all, but in one of them, Chamberlain suggests smuggling watches from France to England in hollowed out books. Unfortunately, we don't have Ilbert's letters. Let's just see what his response was. Perhaps, maybe we'll find them one day. Okay. And here is Chamberlain's Christmas card to Ilbert. And I think this is Chamberlain here, and this is his Margaret Graham, who will become his wife later. And here we have what may well have been Ilbert's response to him. This is one of Ilbert's Christmas cards, and I haven't been able to identify this clock in the collection. None of our clocks have got holly stuffed into them. Perhaps if I put some holly into the clocks, it will become apparent which one it is. And just to add to the pile, here's H. Allen Lloyd's Christmas card to Ilbert. And the point to make is that there's a very strong horological community in London at this time, and Ilbert was firmly in it. Now, so here we have Malcolm Gardner, who's a very close associate of Ilbert's. And Cecil Clutton, founder member of the AHS, who later worked very closely with Ilbert, as we'll hear, tells us it was largely at Ilbert's suggestion that Malcolm Gardner had set up in business as an antiquarian horological dealer. And Cedric Jagger expands on this, also founder member, that he acted virtually as Ilbert's agent. And the two used to go on protracted purchasing expeditions together, and one adventure of the dynamic duo begins in Paris, where Ilbert bought a mid-17th century watch movement by Nicolas Gambier in Paris. Gardner says, "What did you buy that for?" Ilbert replies, "Because I got the case." There's the case. Gardner, "How can you possibly be sure?" Ilbert, "I'll bet you. I'll bring them both to lunch at the Spanish Club on Saturday." There's the movement in this case. Lunch was on Gardner. We're back to Ilbert's at his drawers at 10 Milner Street, studying his watches. And Jagger tells us, yes, another famous feature of Ilbert's clock room was a huge chest of drawers in which he kept his working library of watches. His 24 drawers contained over 1,000 specimens spanning 300 years of watchmaking and was in constant use as a reference source when inquirers bought watches to show him or dealers to sell him. Ilbert enjoyed the friendliest relationships with the trade at large, since he never tried to purchase behind their backs or outdo them at auctions. The result was that he always was given first refusal of anything of special interest that came on market. And indeed, there are many references to Ilbert's kindness and generosity and willing to share his knowledge and collection. And Jacqueline Duncan, Ilbert's niece, remembers the occasion of his portrait being taken. And she suggested to Ilbert that he might go upstairs and tidy himself up. And he came back downstairs, which 5 minutes later looking exactly the same. Here's another view of that room. And Clutton gives us a glimpse. He says, quite disinterested in his surroundings. He lived in one room of his huge house, number 10 Milner Street, Chelsea. And across the passage was the immense double room, the full depth of the house, in which the collection was crammed hugger-mugger. It would have been impossible to dust it, and it never was dusted. Some familiar faces in there. There's the Ballin Carillon clock. What have we got? There's Vichen, musical. Yeah, it's I've got the wrong glasses on. I've just realised. We have another view here of his mantelpiece. More familiar faces. Nib. Funnel there, constant force escapement. Could go on, lovely. And I did say the spaciousness of Milner Street would become important. You can begin to see, and just to show it wasn't all about clocks and watches. And here he is at a dinner party. Where is he? That's Ilbert is there. And also, not in this photograph, there was one other permanent resident at Milner Street, and that was his cat Beat. We'll hear more about the cat later. So now we've set Ilbert up in London. Let's turn to his collecting. And he recorded his collection in this series of ledgers you see here. I've set them up in the round reader room where they now live at the museum. Nice dent clock up on the wall. I think it's got synchronous movements on there, but we do have the original, so maybe we'll put it back one day. But this is where they live, and they're a fantastic resource, as you'll see later. And they ran from the 1920s until the 1950s, which is, and they came to the collection with the museum with the collection. And let's have a look at a typical entry. This is the William Bowyer Lantern clock with the original balance. And just taking from the top down, I'm going to read off this screen because this is the ledger number which we refer to. Very useful. There's the maker of the clock. And here is a very brief description, which he tells us there. Drummond Robertson. So he got the clock from Drummond Robertson, from whom he also got a fantastic collection of Japanese clocks, which are at the museum. And down at the bottom are his acquisition details. So he got it from clothes in May 1943, which is again very useful to us. This one also has the price down there, so how much you pay for it. So, well, we see the clock again in this rather lovely photo of a young Princess Elizabeth. And we know this is taken from Ilbert's scrapbook, which now resides in the clockmaker's archives. And she had a real interest in clocks, and we know she went to the bicentennial exhibition in Grey in 1951 and spent well over an hour there, just looking at the clocks. Talking about the clocks. Now we've got two quizzes here. I've got two quizzes for you today. Number one, we have been assured that this person is and isn't Dan Parks. So if anyone has any issues, please come and see me afterwards. Now let's stop and sniff another rose, shall we? It's one of Ilbert's 29 Tompion watches, and this is a lovely balance spring example from 1688. And this really nice silver pinwork case, tortoiseshell pinwork case. And these were a particular favourite of Ilbert's because he was fascinated by the amount of work that must have gone into them. And we can see how much he paid for it. It's £22 written somewhere. But what we don't have is he hasn't written a date when he bought it. All we have is this stamp date. That's not necessarily when he bought it. That seems to correlate to an insurance appraisal or something like that. And we know that Ilbert insured his collection, but only 1/3 of it, because he reasoned that no one could get away out of the house with more than that. Now, Ilbert didn't just collect things that ticked, and he had 184 prints. Here's one of them. And I'm currently working through these, and we hope to mount an exhibition at the museum in the next couple of years with prints with the relevant object in front, and that would be nice if we can make that happen. He also collected 531 individual watch papers. That's not including the ones still inside the watch cases. None of the prints are recorded in ledgers for some reason. And talking of printed material, he also amassed what Charles Eckert would describe as, without doubt, the most comprehensive and important collection of horological literature in the world. I'm not sure if that still stands true. Look over there, for what I've heard. So, now, still on things that don't tick, he also had 78 scientific instruments. And this one's Ilbert's, this lovely little silver Tompion horizontal inclined dial. And he notes in the ledger it's a duplicate of the gold one at the British Museum. And indeed, the one on the right was donated by Augustus Wallace and Franks in 1886. And I think that's the only non-Ilbert piece you're going to see today. So now the ledgers were transcribed by our fantastic volunteers at the museum several years ago, and from that I've been able to extract data, which is interesting, and I've got loads and loads of graphs. I haven't got time to look at them all, but so it's worth looking at this one. You can see the split of the collection. So most of it is watches, and then a large portion again are just watch movements. Somewhere here we also have watch components, dark blue, but after what there are clocks, chronometers, that's both pockets and real chronometers, if you like. And so you can see where his chief interest was in watches. And if we turn to the drawers of the museum, this is where we store everything. Drawers upon drawers of Ilbert watches. And as I said in the last slide, he was very happy just to cut movements. And Clutton tells us, although Ilbert's knowledge was universal, he was not really interested primarily in decoration, which we see here. And Ernest Hillary, who wrote a 2-part article on the collection in the 1950s, added, Mr. Ilbert has no great liking for toys. So we can see the direction he was collecting. Now, I'm not going to go into many reasons why watch movements become dissociated from their cases. It's not a story for today, but what we can say is we are left with an extensive reference collection of charting the development of horology, which is fantastic. So we don't mind too much. We have plenty of cases as well. Now another extraction of data. This is a list of whose bank balances were most inflated from Ilbert's obsession. At the top we have his closer in Gardner, who we've spoken about. And next we have NAWCC. They're a high-end jeweller working out to St James's, and whether that's something to do with the fact that it was less than 2 miles from Ilbert's home, I don't know. That's maybe always number 2, but I won't go down the whole list. But at the bottom we have somebody called Plum, and there's another story. On one of their trips, one of Ilbert and Gardner's trips, George Brown, the proprietor of the Breguet premises in Paris, took a look at a watch that Gardner had worked on and said, "A plumber has done his thing." And then thereafter, Ilbert called Gardner Plum. So we should really be adding those 2 numbers together. But it was an excuse to tell that story, so I left it. We don't know who Pizarro is or what Pizarro is. We know it's a town in South Spain, but whether Ilbert went there or whether it was a somebody or something, we don't know. So if anybody has any idea who it is, please come and see me after. Next table of figures. Sorry, this is all a bit small, but I felt the need to get it all in. But I'll just talk through some of them. Is the biggest single spends, and the clocks that he spent most on in the ledgers. Not all the clocks are in the ledgers, including some of the very best ones. We don't know why that is. Maybe they're insured separately, that could be the reason. But at the top of this list, or the ledger list, is this lovely little repeating clock, sine square with a Tompion movement. It's a lovely thing indeed. And I won't talk on this list because we haven't got time. So we will. Now, there is a column here. This is the amount he actually spent, and I've tried to convert it to modern day money using an online inflation calculator. I think you can see inflation doesn't bear much resemblance to the highs and lows of the horological market. So it's interesting to put it in, but we shouldn't put too much stock into that. But if the total spend, we had all the figures up, including the ones that aren't on this chart, so it's £20,163, which is, using this calculator, very roughly about £1 million in today's money. So he's spending his money well. Next we have Ilbert's top 10 makers. At the top of the list we have Breguet, that includes the fakes, and I know we have a fake upstairs in the cabinet. But I think it's worth leaving them together because it just shows this is obviously clearly Ilbert's key interest. Closely followed by Early Norton, which I didn't know until a few years ago. So that's and for those who, sure there's some people here wondering, but this is all the armaments together. Now, if here we have, here's a little graph, a cumulative graph of acquisitions by date. It's not 100% reliable, but it shows some things. The first entry is in 1928, which is a little bit curious in itself, because we know he was collecting from 1925, well, we know he's collecting from his childhood. So he starts the ledgers then for whatever reason, and he may have been backdating because the first part of the graph is steeper than the next part. There's no other obvious reason why the rate should fall off there, but he may have retired from engineering around then. We're not exactly sure. And then there's more, this king here is a bit easier to explain, 1940, Second World War. And it trickles in up actually until 1954. The graph's a little bit off there, but that's when he fell seriously ill, a couple of years before his death. So, we'll do for time.
Good.
About halfway.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I haven't been able to extract from the ledger data yet is place of production of this collection, because it's a real mix of cities and countries, and it's a nice job for one of our volunteers to clean that data, and then we'll be able to get the graph and see where he was collected. I think it's safe to say England and London are fairly high on that list. So instead of a chart, I've thrown a consolation prize for the audience. Mm-hmm. And this is a Scalisize watch from the New England Watch Company, dated 1912. And Ilbert had 79 items from over here in his collection. Over half of them were wateries, and none of them were fakes. So, Ilbert seems to have been collecting online. He seems to have been collecting American horology at a time when a few other Europeans were. So I think that's to his credit. And commenting on a similar watch, American watch, Ilbert once said, "Technology and money will never meet at this level again." And I must say, my last few days here in New York, I have learned so much more about American horology. My horizons have exploded, and I'm grateful for that. It's worth the trip alone, so thank you. 2 clocks, 2 of Mudge's finest timepieces, I should say. So we're going to have a quiz again now. This is Mudge number 1, his ring timekeeper, made in about 1770. I'm nervous that Jonathan gets this.
I'm not saying anything.
And on the right we have Mudge's lunar/experimental lever timekeeper, made in 1754. And one of these, I'll read Ernest Hellery again. One such table held parts of, I'm jumping the gun there, oh yeah. One such table held parts of a clock that Mr. Ilbert confesses gave him a bigger thrill to own than any other in his collection. It was made by Thomas Mudge. It must have been one of these 2. Who wants to vote for the one on the left? Who wants to vote for the one on the right? Yeah. There we go. Yeah, Jacqueline Duncan will confirms that was the clock on the right. So, there you go. Now I think we're in a little doubt that Ilbert's horological knowledge is rather significant, but we have very little information on his practical abilities. Now, of the clock on the right, Ilbert writes to the notable restorer Philip Thornton, "Good Lord, I only wish the Mudge was as simple as it looks on that diagram in the book I sent you. I had to take it down as the wheel was damaged before I got it. This took me about 3 hours to engage so that the pair of wheels would revolve around the 3 wheels without a hard spot arising, owing to the play in the centre wheel coming to an end before the circuit was made." And it was also recorded that Ilbert said, "Never again." So it seems that Ilbert was happy to get stuck in, but he was also humble about his limits, and I think that's a really important quality for any good conservator. Now, Ilbert goes on to say, "I can't tell you the date of the clock, probably 1765, it descended through the Brunels. Lady Brunel was Mudge's sister-in-law, and the last of them was my boss at the office. Old Brunel left it to an old friend of his from Devon, who had already inherited the Mudge original 8A Marine. And I got them both from his executors in Devon. Providence to die for, I think. Now, here's another piece that may have had the touch of Ilbert. Originally made in 1774 by John Arnold, but the watch tells us more about itself. Up here written in French, but I will translate on the fly. The first Tourbillon regulator by Breguet incorporated in one of the first works of Arnold, Breguet's homage to the revered memory of Arnold presented to his son in the year 1808. Important thing. Clutton then tells us, Ilbert once told me, when he acquired it, the tourbillon platform brackets, I think, was damaged, and I believe he made the replacement himself after several attempts. Quite characteristic of his indomitable patience and great executive skill, thus combining the skill of three of the greatest horologists of all time, Arnold, Breguet and Ilbert. This case is certainly of unsurpassed importance. So, you know, you can take different views on that. Maybe not such good news for BM if tourbillon's not original. We'll have to have a closer look and study that. Excuse me. Now we're going to move on to Ilbert's later years. Now this is the wonderful miniature bracket clock, it's really a table clock by Tompion, from the very end of the 17th century. Now very well known by serial number 222. It's very big, so it's got a silver mount, the line and a unicorn, suggesting it's possibly a royal provenance, but we don't know for sure. And there's another wonderful story of how Ilbert matched the original case to the clock movement, or should I say clockwork, so I'm sure. If I have to translate, I think I don't need to. But we don't have the time for that one. It's for another day, I'm afraid. And apparently, this is Ilbert's hand. That's not why I'm showing it to you. The reason I actually showed it is because in 1952, Ilbert sold the clock to Simmons for £5,000. Sorry, it's scrawled across here, and he says it's for his retirement. But he's far from done. Following the death of Bailey in 1951, Ilbert was enlisted by Cecil Clutton to help complete the 7th edition of Britain's Old Clocks and Clock Watches and Their Makers. And that's the book that's helped start many a horological library, including mine. Clutton recalls, we were able to draw on Bailey's list of makers to bring up to date and slightly amplify Britain's much shorter but more detailed list. This really dreadful chore was done entirely by Ilbert. What I did not realise was that Ilbert was not capable of marshalling his knowledge in a way that could be presented in book form. Those who enjoyed his friendship know what an immensely retiring, kindly, eccentric and whimsical character he was. Among his many strange characteristics was an extreme reluctance to commit himself on almost any subject. He also had a cat, of which he was deeply attached. When really pushed into a corner over anything, where he had to make a positive statement, his invariable escape technique was to gaze at the ceiling, murmuring, "My poor cat, oh my poor cat." This was not very helpful so far as the 7th edition of Bristol was concerned. Excuse me. Indeed, I could only find one short article penned by Ilbert, appeared in the 6th issue of Antiquarian Horology, entitled Tompion Broadsheet in French. I have all these references, if you need them. Now, Ilbert was elected as a fellow of the BHI in 1947, and then in 1949 was elected chairman of the BHI's newly formed Antiquarian and Collectors section. And then he retired from that in 1952. James Knight's most excellent article, I have to say that because it's here, the Antiquarian Horological Society in Early History, he tells us that the late and great Rodney Law said Ilbert seemed shy and ill at ease in the chair. And here he is in a chair, not the chair, but he doesn't look particularly at ease, I must agree. So this is from that period. This is the BHI Executive Lounge. Now, despite this, two significant exhibitions were staged under his chairmanship. There was the aforementioned Graham Bicentennial at the Royal Society of Arts in 1951, which is the Queen went. And then there's the British Clockmakers Heritage Exhibition at the Science Museum in 1952. And Ilbert also played a key part in the formation of the AHS. When he and several other members of the BHI executive resigned on the 1st of October 1953, they all piled over to Milner Street and beat up the very beginnings of the AHS, what would become the AHS. And I'm hoping we can hear a bit more about that later. I don't have any time for it. So it's a good story. But you can, James's article if you need to. And then a year later, in 1954, Ilbert was admitted to the livery of the Clockmakers Company and became their anti-crown advisor. It was a very busy 5 years for Ilbert. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Ilbert's ledger entries stopped in 1954, and he was taken seriously ill at his home in Milner Street. Jagger tells us his illness was both painful and excessively disabling, yet his indomitable spirit enabled him to continue the work he loved right to the very end, even after he had, to a substantial extent, lost the power of speech. And this included his work on Britain, as he carried on with. Jagger continues, the finishing touches were put to the text only while he was confined to his bed in hospital, and he was a fitting memorial to such a man that at least some part of his enormous knowledge did find its way onto the printed page for the benefit of many who always tried, however unsuccessfully, to emulate him. And Ilbert did see the book published just a few weeks before he died, in March 1956. And Courtenay once said to his niece, Declan, it's been such fun. It's not over yet. Here we are back at Francillon in Devon, where he's buried next to his mother. And now, I've read, if we look at the antiquarian in the digital journal archive and the antiquarian horological website, which James was beating the drum for yesterday, and I can attest to the fact it's an immensely useful resource. If you're not members, join. Because all the quotations you've heard from me today, which I thought were important to hear from the people who knew him, who he was, I got from there. I put Ilbert in the search bar, it came back with 700 odd results, and I went through every single one, and it would have been hard to do that otherwise. And also, because it's on computer, you can get data out of it. So I just totted up, very broad, crude if you like. I just counted the number of entries, hit results from each year, and I think it tells us something interesting. The first few years, his first mentions in 1932, that's when he is recorded as becoming a member of the BHI. And it's a trickle of, mentions, thanks, people he's either given advice to or he's allowed them access to his collection. But then it seriously ramps up in the late 40s. And that's when he gets seriously involved with the BHI and then the AHS. And then we have his death in 1956, and the plaudits still rolling in, but then our rate of mentions does gradually take off. But this is what I find really interesting. The rate of mentions is greater than it was at the beginning for this boom period. And at first it is people who are reminiscing about Ilbert, but that turns into people who have come to see his collection at the British Museum and are referencing it. And it says to me he's really living on through his collection. It's really nice to see. And there's a little bump at the end again. And I'll put that down to Paul's research and the Dingleby Lecture and his articles. So that's nice to see. We continue sort of on his memory. So yes. Now we'll move on to his bequest. And the question this is we won't go into it in detail, but I know there's a question on all your minds. Did he spend it all on clothes and watches? And the answer is no. He left £34,900, about £1 million today, so clearly not. His chief beneficiaries were his nephew Michael Inchbald and his niece Mrs. Sykes. There are only two bequests outside of the family. One was a Tonkin degree clock that went to Greenwich, and the other was his colossal library that went to the British Horological Institute. Now I mentioned there that the archivist there, now the Museum of Timekeeping, Dr. Robert Finnegan, has recently completed catalogue of the archives and library, and it's all on a spreadsheet, so I had a sneak preview, and it is indeed immense, so there's a new resource for us all there. So I'll go and see that in due course for some research. Well, I have seen it, but I've spent about an hour on it. I will spend about a week on it at least. So now, as for the rest of the collection, Clutton tells us Ilbert always envisaged that his collection would be broken up for the benefit of his family on the one hand, and to give pleasure to collectors on the other. So the collection did go to his niece and nephew, and they subsequently arranged his sale. And that's a fantastic story, really exciting, dramatic. It was offered to the British Museum, it went backwards and forwards, and the deal was sealed literally an hour and a half before the deadline. And I can't go into the story today, it's a fascinating one, but suffice to say, the collection came to the museum, or most of it. There's a few pieces that stayed in the family. So now we're going to skip forward now to the present day and really just have a quick look at its impact at the museum. A couple more charts, in fact I'm only going to show one chart because there's not time. Just to show his collection still forms, this big blue slice of the pie is Ilbert. It still forms over half of the horological holdings at the museum. And if you look at and suffice to say, these are the other, he's split by the major collectors, and he's dominating them all. We've had some notable ones since: Paul Baker collection of tools, Glambourne collection of 20th century British factory-made clocks. Fantastic stuff, but Ilbert is still the boss of the British Museum. Now, you've got to have someone to put all this. And in 1963, what was called the Ilbert Room opened. And this is the view from my office. Some guys have all the lights, don't they? And this is, it's recently refurbished. New floor, new lights, same old furniture, which is wonderful. And you're all welcome. There's a facility to be used. We have groups here. We maybe introductory talks. We pass around objects for the general public, or we have more advanced talks for more learned societies. Individuals come in with their clocks and watches, we try and give our opinion on them, or serious researchers come in and we'll start taking things apart. And it's there so people can look at the collection without gallery glass in the way. We're also very positive lending to other institutions, and I like to think Ilbert would have been pleased, even if the collection wasn't split up. Moving on to the galleries, this is a picture taken before Paul retired. It's Paul Buck, who did all the research here. And there's my colleague Laura Turner, and there's me, looking at some of the watches. Not staged at all, that photograph. Well, I did mention that some of the collections stayed in the family. This clock, Breguet 3-wheel clock, Breguet 111, came to us in 2015. Fantastic clock. 2 forms of temperature compensation, equation, Republican calendar here, and it's just a beautiful, Napoleon's emblem there, that's the story behind that. I could talk about this for hours, and I do, because I give talks about it, and I will publish it one day. But it's a fantastic thing, and if we turn to our left from this point, we've got to be careful who you meet. And I think that's Jean there, but yeah, she was over here in the picture before, but that was, there we go. That's a good one, Bob, so use that one. And then moving downstairs, in our gallery 2, we devote our gallery 2 to the museum's great collectors, and in this corner, these cases here and bridges here is devoted to Ilbert. And last year, we were given by his great niece, Amanda Inchbold, who unfortunately died last year. She wished Courtney's personal wristwatch to come and join the rest of his friends at the museum. So now we have it, and we're going to put it in there in due course, as soon as we get the mountain label made. So that's really nice to have a Zenith from 1929. Really nice thing to have. Apart from the radioactive radium tape, which is always a problem. It's just low enough, it's safe. You put it behind the glass, it can't be measured, it's not dangerous. So we can get it. So, and some of you might recognise this chap because he just happened to wander past Charles Allward. He agreed to pose. So we're just about there. So what I'll say is it's all free. Not collection, but access is all free. Just come to the museum anytime, check the opening times, and if you want to come down to the study room, contact me or book an appointment. The door is always open to you. So in conclusion, I've tried my best to on that builder today through my words and words that people knew. So we're going to finish on Cedric Jagger. And I need to finish. It says, Ilbert was a man of retiring disposition, gentle and quiet, but shrewd and in his own way both friendly and generous. His encyclopedic knowledge of horology became legendary in his own lifetime, as did his collection and supporting library, both without doubt the finest of their kind in the world of his day. He was generous in helping others of like interests, with explanations illustrated by examples from among his own acquisitions, and frequently lent his greatest treasures for public exhibition, losing thereby on occasion when they came back from some overseas commitment, deranged or damaged, yet he never grumbled. So we're going to now leave him at his drawers, leave him looking over my shoulder, leave him pretending to inspect his collection, and just say a big thank you to him, a big thank you to you for listening.